I spent much of my time trying to keep things afloat after my husband left. The days were predictable. Wake up, work at my pottery studio, and come home to a quiet house that no longer held the laughter it once did. At 39, I never thought I'd be starting over, but life, as I learned, had a way of throwing you into uncharted waters. Jack was the one constant in my life. My son had just turned 18, tall and growing into himself in ways that made me proud. His laughter, his energy, and his kindness were like pieces of a home I thought I'd lost. Yet, as close as we were, there was always that unspoken distance. After all, he was young, stepping into the world of independence, and I tried not to cling too tightly. But one evening changed everything. I was in the studio, my fingers shaping clay as the soft hum of classical music filled the room. The act of creating pottery had become my therapy. The spinning wheel, the earthy scent of wet clay, it grounded me. I didn't hear him come in at first, not until his voice, soft but curious, broke the spell. "Mom, what are you working on?" I looked up, startled but smiling. "Just a vase. Nothing fancy." He walked closer, peering over my shoulder with a curious gaze. "It's more than that. It's calming the way you work." Chuckled. "You say that now, but when your hands are covered in clay, it's a different story." Jack grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Then teach me." I hesitated. Teaching him meant sharing something personal. My pottery wasn't just a hobby. It was where I poured all my emotions, especially after my husband's betrayal. But Jack's enthusiasm was contagious, and before I knew it, I was guiding his hands, showing him how to shape the clay. His fingers brushed against mine as we worked. I told myself it was nothing, just a mother helping her son. But the warmth of his touch lingered longer than it should have. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the spinning wheel, but my heart betrayed me with its unsteady rhythm. As the evening wore on, the air between us grew heavier, though neither of us said anything. When Jack finally finished his piece, a lopsided bowl that made him laugh, we cleaned up together, our arms brushing occasionally, sending shivers down my spine. "Thanks for teaching me," he said softly as we stood by the sink. His gaze lingered on mine, and for a moment, the world outside the studio ceased to exist. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Anytime, Jack." But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. It wasn't the gaze of a child seeking approval from his mother. It was something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. The days that followed were filled with stolen glances and lingering silences. Jack would find excuses to join me in the studio, and I found myself looking forward to it more than I should have. We shared stories, laughter, and moments that blurred the line between comfort and something more. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack broke the silence. "I'm glad we have this time together, Mom. I know things have been hard since Dad left, but you've been amazing." His words, so simple yet so heartfelt, made tears sting my eyes. I turned to him, my hand finding his. "I couldn't have done it without you." Our fingers intertwined naturally, and the warmth of his touch was both comforting and dangerous. My heart pounded, and when he leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek, I froze. "Jack," my voice trembled, but I didn't pull away. "I know," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "It's confusing, but I'm here." And in that moment, I realized how fragile the boundaries we had built truly were. That evening, the air had that familiar late autumn chill, the kind that seeps through the windows and clings to your skin, urging you to find warmth somewhere, whether in blankets, the flicker of a fire, or perhaps in company. The studio smelled of damp clay and lavender-scented candles I had lit for a bit of comfort. The radio hummed softly, the delicate notes of jazz filling the quiet corners of the room. My fingers were slick with clay as I worked on a cup that I envisioned being delicate but purposeful, slender at the base, widening into a soft, graceful curve. I was so focused that I didn't notice Jack until I heard the sound of the studio door creak open behind me. "Mom," his voice called gently, cutting through the music like a familiar melody. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, 2 glasses of wine balanced carefully in one hand and a bottle tucked under his arm. His smile was warm, and there was something about the way he carried himself, steady, mature, confident, that caught me off guard. The boy I had raised was now a man. His presence filling the room in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. "I figured you could use a break," he said, stepping inside and setting the glasses down on the small work table near my wheel. I wiped my hands on a towel and laughed softly. "You figured right. It's been a long day." Jack poured the wine, the deep red liquid catching the flickering candlelight as it filled the glass. He handed me one and clinked his against mine with a soft, "To us." "To us," I teased, raising an eyebrow. He grinned, a playful twinkle in his eye. "To us, because we're getting through everything together." I felt my heart squeeze, warmth spreading in places I had long forgotten. I took a sip, the wine warming my throat as I glanced back at the cup spinning on the wheel. "Let me help," Jack said suddenly, setting down his glass and rolling up the sleeves of his sweater. His forearms were strong, the veins prominent, a detail I tried not to focus on but couldn't ignore. He moved with a self-assuredness that was new to me, a quiet but noticeable shift from the boy who once sought my approval with every little thing. I laughed nervously. "I'm not sure you remember how messy this can get." "Then I'll get messy," he said easily, stepping behind me and placing his hands on my shoulders for a brief second before moving around to sit on the stool next to me. His touch, though brief, left a lingering warmth on my skin. "Let's make this cup together." I couldn't say no, even if I wanted to. There was something soothing about sharing this moment with him. The wheel spun slowly as I guided the clay, my fingers steady but my thoughts anything but. Jack leaned in closer, watching my hands carefully as he mimicked my movements. His fingers, larger and warmer than mine, molded the clay gently, occasionally brushing against my own. Each time our hands met, an electric current seemed to pass between us, subtle but undeniable. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his presence was magnetic, pulling my thoughts in directions I wasn't ready to confront. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. I let out a soft laugh. "It's years of practice. You'll get there." His eyes, dark and intense, flicked up to meet mine. "I'm not just talking about the clay, Mom." I stilled, the wheel continuing to spin beneath our hands as the room seemed to shrink around us. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, but he didn't look away. There was a tenderness in his gaze, a quiet understanding that I hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. "Jack," I whispered, my voice betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "I know," he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "I know it's complicated. But I've been watching you these past few months. How much you've given up, how hard you've worked to keep everything together. And I just want you to know that you don't have to do it alone anymore." I blinked, my throat tightening as tears threatened to spill. How long had it been since someone had said that to me? Since someone had noticed how tired I was, how much I had carried without complaint. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Jack smiled gently, his hand brushing against mine once more as we shaped the clay into something beautiful, something fragile but resilient. The cup began to take form, a perfect blend of his touch and mine. In that moment it felt symbolic, as if we were creating something far beyond pottery. The jazz music hummed in the background, the candles casting soft shadows on the walls, and the wine warmed my chest as we worked in tandem. There was a comfort in the silence between us, but beneath it, something else stirred, something unspoken yet deeply understood. As we finished the cup, Jack leaned back, wiping his hands on a towel and grinning proudly. "Not bad for my first try, huh?" I chuckled, inspecting the cup. "Not bad at all." He stood up, stretching slightly, and for a moment, I couldn't help but admire the way he had grown into himself. His confidence wasn't forced, it was natural, like he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. And the way he looked at me with such genuine care made my chest ache in the most confusing yet comforting way. Jack grabbed the wine bottle and refilled our glasses, handing mine back to me before raising his own. To new beginnings. I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about the cup or the evening, it was about everything. The way we had leaned on each other, the way our relationship had shifted, becoming something deeper, something neither of us had expected but couldn't ignore. To new beginnings, I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The wine tasted sweeter this time, or maybe it was the warmth in the room, the warmth in Jack's gaze, that made everything feel different. As we sipped in silence, standing side by side in the soft glow of the studio, I realized that the line between what was familiar and what was new had blurred. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't afraid of where it might lead. I sighed, setting my half-full glass of wine on the nearby table. My body felt warm, not just from the drink but from the comforting atmosphere Jack had created in this little cocoon of clay and candlelight. My muscles ached, a dull reminder of how long I had been hunched over the spinning wheel. The tension in my shoulders had become so familiar that I hardly noticed it anymore, until now, when exhaustion tugged at every part of me. Jack noticed. He always noticed. "Mom," he said softly, tilting his head as he leaned against the table, watching me. His gaze wasn't the casual glance of a son checking on his mother. It was deeper, more intentional, like he was quietly studying me. "You're tired." I waved a hand, brushing off his concern. "I'm fine. It's nothing." But Jack wasn't convinced. He set his glass down and stepped closer, the warm, earthy scent of clay clinging to both of us. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his thumb gently grazing the curve where my neck met my collarbone, and I stiffened slightly at the unexpected warmth of his touch. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," he murmured, his fingers lightly tracing the tension in my muscles. "Let me help." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, he was already guiding me toward the small worn couch tucked in the corner of the studio. It was the couch I used when I needed a break, a place to sit and sketch new designs or sip tea when the wheel became too demanding. Tonight, though, it seemed like an entirely different space, a safe haven where the outside world faded away, leaving only the soft glow of candlelight and the sound of Jack's steady breathing. "Sit down," he urged gently, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had caught me off guard earlier. Reluctantly, I sat, sinking into the familiar cushions. My hands rested awkwardly in my lap, still slightly damp from the clay. Jack crouched in front of me, his fingers brushing mine as he grabbed a towel to dry them. The simple gesture, so thoughtful, so tender, made my breath hitch. He wasn't rushing, wasn't treating this like an obligation. Every movement felt deliberate, like he genuinely wanted to take care of me. "Turn around," he said softly. I hesitated for a moment before shifting on the couch, my back facing him. I pulled my hair to one side, draping it over my shoulder, and felt a shiver run down my spine as the cool air touched the back of my neck. Then Jack's hands were there, warm, firm, and soothing. His thumbs pressed gently into the base of my neck, and I exhaled sharply, the release of tension more overwhelming than I expected. "Jack," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You really don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me take care of you for once." His hands moved slowly, expertly, as though he'd been doing this for years. His thumbs worked in circular motions, easing the knots in my shoulders while his fingers traced gentle lines along the curve of my neck. The warmth of his touch spread through me, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the sensation, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to let go. The world outside the studio melted away, replaced by the rhythmic pressure of Jack's hands and the steady sound of our breathing. His touch wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone in carrying the weight of everything. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of relief. "Mom," Jack whispered, leaning in slightly, his breath warm against my ear. "You've done so much for me. It's okay to let someone be there for you." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "I'm fine," I said, my voice cracking despite my best effort to sound composed. He paused for a moment, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "No, you're not. And that's okay." His honesty unraveled something inside me. I had spent so long being strong, holding everything together after my husband left, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. But here, in the dim glow of the studio, with Jack's hands grounding me, it felt safe to let the walls crack. I turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. His eyes were soft, filled with concern and something else I couldn't quite name but felt deeply. The air between us shifted, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. My breath hitched as I realized how close we were. Close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, smell the faint hint of wine on his breath. "Jack," my voice trembled, and I didn't know if it was from fear or anticipation. He didn't pull away. Instead, his thumb brushed gently along my cheek, wiping away the tear I hadn't realized was still there. The tenderness of the gesture made my heart race. "You're not just my mom," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're everything to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. My chest tightened, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over me. Confusion, fear, but also an undeniable warmth that I couldn't ignore. Jack leaned in, his forehead resting gently against mine, and for a moment we just breathed, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "But I'm scared." "I know," he whispered, his fingers tracing soothing circles on my back. "I'm too. But we don't have to figure it all out tonight." The weight of his words settled over me, comforting in their simplicity. He wasn't asking for answers or promises. He was offering me a moment, just this moment, to feel something other than the weight of the past. I closed my eyes and exhaled, leaning into him as his arms wrapped around me. His embrace was strong, steady, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry everything on my own anymore. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the studio bathed in soft light and the scent of clay lingering in the air. When we finally pulled apart, Jack smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I nodded, my heart still racing but lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you, Jack." He stood, offering me his hand, and I took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine as he helped me to my feet. As I left the studio that night, the world outside felt different. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because I knew I wasn't facing them alone. The warm water of the shower cascaded over me, soothing my tired muscles, but my mind remained restless. My thoughts lingered on the events of the evening. Jack's gentle words, the warmth of his hands on my shoulders, and the tenderness that had settled between us like an unspoken promise. I closed my eyes, letting the water wash over me, but no amount of steam could ease the fluttering in my chest. After drying off, I slipped into my soft nightgown, the fabric brushing against my skin as I made my way down the quiet hallway to my bedroom. The house was calm, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. I crawled under the covers, but sleep didn't come. My thoughts spun in circles, replaying the way Jack had looked at me in the studio. Concerned, caring, and so much more aware of my struggles than I had realized. I shifted in bed, hugging the pillow to my chest as moonlight filtered through the curtains. I wanted to relax, to let myself drift off, but my heart refused to settle. Just when I thought I would be trapped in this sleepless loop, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. "Mom." Jack's voice was gentle, hesitant, but it carried through the quiet of the night like a lifeline. I sat up, my breath catching slightly. "Come in." The door opened, and Jack stepped inside. His hair tousled and his eyes soft in the dim light. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and his presence brought an instant warmth to the room. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, closing the door behind him. I smiled faintly. "Neither could I." For a moment we just looked at each other. Then he hesitated before asking, "Do you mind if I sit with you?" I shook my head and shifted over, making room for him. The bed dipped slightly as he sat beside me, his presence filling the space with a quiet comfort. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt like we were both searching for the right words, balancing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. "I keep thinking about earlier," Jack said softly. His gaze focused on the blanket as his fingers traced invisible patterns along the fabric. "And I need to say this." I held my breath, waiting. "You've always been everything to me," he continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But these past few months, I've seen how much you've gone through. I've watched you give so much of yourself, and I realized how much I want to be here for you. Not just as your son but as someone you can rely on. You deserve to feel supported." His words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, unraveling emotions I had been holding tightly for too long. I blinked rapidly, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to fall. "Jack, you've already done so much for me." "It's not enough," he said gently, turning toward me. "I want to do more. I care about you so much, and I hate seeing you carry this weight alone." His hand reached for mine beneath the blanket, and the warmth of his touch was grounding. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself feel the comfort of someone who understood me in ways I hadn't expected. For so long I had been strong out of necessity, but in this moment I didn't have to be. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice shaky but genuine. Jack's thumb brushed gently over my knuckles, and the simple gesture brought a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in years. His eyes met mine, and the connection we shared in that moment felt like a silent promise that I wasn't alone. "You mean the world to me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt tears slide down my cheeks, but this time I didn't wipe them away. They weren't tears of sadness. They were the release of everything I had held in for far too long. Jack shifted closer, his arms wrapping around me as I rested my head on his shoulder. The steady rhythm of his breathing lulled me into a sense of peace, and for the first time that night, my thoughts began to settle. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," I said quietly, my voice muffled against him. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," he replied. "Let's just take it one step at a time." I nodded, comforted by the simplicity of his words. He wasn't asking for answers or solutions. He was offering me the space to breathe, to feel, and to let go of the weight I had been carrying. As I closed my eyes, the warmth of his embrace wrapped around me like a shield, protecting me from the loneliness that had haunted me for so long. We sat like that for a while, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. When I finally pulled away, Jack smiled gently and brushed a tear from my cheek. "You should get some rest." I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Good night, Jack." "Good night, Mom," he said softly before leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank back into the pillows, my heart still racing but no longer in turmoil. The warmth of his words lingered, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe it.